I have to uninstall and reinstall the latest version or something, I think.
We won't worry about it now.
Okay.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. So today, February 11th, is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So it's a big month here on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Every February, we kick all the men out and we host exclusively women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation from all over the world. So this month has been a blast so far. Lots of events still to come over the next 2.5 weeks. But today I'm really excited to be joined by National Geographic explorer Asher Jay. She's an international adventurer and public figure whose compelling paintings, sculptures, installations, animations, ad campaigns, and films all have a single purpose: to incite global action on behalf of wildlife conservation. So her travels to the front line have made her witness and storyteller, combating illegal wildlife trafficking, promoting habitat sanctuaries, and illuminating humanitarian emergencies. So our core message again and again is the loss of biodiversity that we are experiencing in the age of men. Well, Asher, it's so awesome to have you joining us from the West Coast today. We've got a great group of classrooms from across North America, and we're looking forward to get to know you a little better today.
It sounds great. But I look at a unique nexus between science, art, and public awareness, public education, and how that all intersects with real on-the-ground impact and policy change that tethers to that. So it's sort of an interdisciplinary career path. I have to be informed on all fronts in order to be able to structure my campaigns or my outreach in ways that actually mobilize people past what they do know in a manner that doesn't feel dissonant to them, because the minute people feel like you're really pushing an agenda or a conclusion onto them, they're less likely to be receptive to it. And so my whole challenge is to galvanize or mobilize people towards calls to action that results in genuine economic and ecological impacts that are positive for the collective welfare of both human and wild species, to ensure that we find a holistic balance between the two, because we are interdependent whether we realize it or not. And time and again, we're making rather myopic choices, very short-sighted choices in regards to particularly our consumer habits. And so one of the things I focus on a lot of late is, particularly because of our current government structure, is that I focus on corporations and holding them accountable. Because if I can get them to look at a triple bottom line, which is to say that they're looking at their social impact, they're looking at their environmental impact, as well as their capacity to generate profits while being sustainable. So are they scalable while being sustainable? And that's the kind of companies I try to get promoted or like advocate for, because they can be genuine stewards for how we can better participate with our dollars. So every time you open your wallet, you're not buying a product that's going to result in further denudation or the loss of, indigenous rights or women's rights in the world. Rather, you're supporting this mechanism that's already been thought through and is running largely as a cradle to cradle framework. My career started out as an artist, like not even quite. Before that I was doing, so let's go way back. In high school and early years of university, I was initially in sciences because that's what everyone said I should be doing. But at that point, I was also modeling a lot and had a great exposure to the fashion industry. And so I decided to make the shift towards being in fashion. So I started studying at Parsons School of Design in New York, and I did my fashion design bachelorette. And then I followed that up with 2 years in textile design and development. So I was very focused in the textile markets, and I knew the sheer volume of negative impact that industry was having. And in good conscience, I couldn't continue working on 7th Avenue in New York because I just saw the immediate and horrific impact of waste. And it's so seasonally driven that the amount of excess that we result in is pretty compelling. It's hard not to react to that in some way, either positive or negative. And so I decided to start addressing this issue of waste that kept coming up for me. But it also tied into a time when I went to Africa with my mom for a vacation, and I saw literally 80 kilometers driving into the Masai Mara was just garbage. There was just plastic bags on acacia trees, zebras and giraffes eating plastic, like bags and garbage. I was just completely taken aback that that was going to be my experience of Africa. And I'd been there when I was a really young kid and with a completely different understanding. And I come back as a slightly older version of me, and I see that in 10 years, there's been a marked loss of ecological integrity in this landscape. And so for the 2 weeks that I was there with my mom, she basically said that she never wants to go on a trip with me again, because I spent the whole time collecting garbage and reporting it to rangers, talking about littering to the local tourists, I mean, not to the local tourists, to the locals and to the tourists. And I really just wanted to see people be more conscious about how they were stepping into a different landscape that wasn't their backyard, that wasn't their home. But I also wanted the locals to speak out more against these tourists, because there is a weird bias where they just let tourists get away with anything because they have money. And, they would just throw a cigarette butt out of their Jeep, and it was not something that people really talked about. Like, they didn't address it right then and there. So I took it upon myself to take down those license plate numbers, report all these people, like hold everyone accountable. And I think that's the most powerful thing we can do as individuals, is to hold each other accountable, to hold ourselves accountable, and to hold the world at large accountable to its holistic expression, to its fullest and highest expression of self. Which means that we do have to look out for all these other species. It's not just about us, because our lives are intrinsically dependent upon all these other species. And so for that 2 weeks, just doing this one thing of picking up garbage every day and reporting everyone and talking about it to every person I met changed the narrative, because then the hotel I was staying at would call ahead to the next place we were going to, because that's, you always have to list where you're going to and where you're coming from on all of the hotel forms in Africa. And they would call ahead and tell the next hotel, like, this girl's coming, she's real trouble, she's going to like inspect your recycling, look at your sewage disposal, and she wants to know how you're dealing with your garbage in the coming 10 years. She wants a 10-year plan for waste. And so, I mean, as a 17-year-old, to have that impact where I was really getting on all these people's nerves and pushing the boundaries on holding individuals answerable for their actions was pretty compelling for me to see that I could have that impact. And then when I came back and I was in fashion, I saw this waste narrative emerge again. So I kept working on ways to show what was happening to our natural world using the waste that I found around me. So this, like the previous works, are made out of plastic and garbage that I found in Africa. This one was made out of fabric waste on 7th Avenue in New York. So I've always been very conscientious about looking at waste. And here's another example of it, using plastic bottles as a conduit, like a wet vessel. I just basically decoupaged each of them and painted them with different narratives of the ocean using waste paper that was being dumped out by offices. And once again, allowing each bottle to serve as a portal for a voice, a human voice to be heard that was speaking out for a specific issue. And if you hear all of those voices together, it almost creates like a bait ball, those giant swarms of fish that swim together like a giant school. So similar to that, like instead of a giant school of fish, it was a giant school of bottles, and they all had voices within them speaking out. And so I figured, it's about the wisdom of the crowds. It's about getting multiple people together to show that united we have greater impact, because individually we can each tell a story. Like one person's talking about turtles, another person's talking about pelicans, but together you're changing the narrative, because the underlying pattern that underscores the issues impacting every one of these species is the same. And ultimately it comes to just human arrogance, human apathy, and human consumerism, just avaricious consumerism. And then I started taking it out to different universities and schools. So kids from all age groups participated, created their own bottles, created their own satellite installations in their school, putting in voices of their community to showcase, the impact of plastic in their backyard. I also did quirky things like, I wanted to reach new demographics, because oftentimes in the environmental movement, we're speaking to people who already are in the know. And the part of the premise is to push the boundaries on who we are addressing, and if we're actually moving the needle, or if we are just, patting each other on the back for knowing that we all speak the same language, because that's not really galvanizing a market shift in global consciousness. And so what I started doing was packaging waste in boxes that I collected just from my own backyard and neighborhood. And I would call it, like I made up this country called Garbagia. And I was selling real estate investments into my country, which was basically trash in boxes by the cubic feet. And that was funny to people, so people bought into it. But I basically used the money they gave by buying my trash to go and work on more cleanup initiatives and cleanup efforts. I also used a lot of the boxes of, like, food boxes, that because they have cross contamination, they don't get recycled. So I was using a lot of pizza boxes to create art on demand, so people could take art home instead of throw this in the landfill. And I went to, like, Mexico for a brief while, and I saw these massive filter feeders, like free diving with whale sharks and manta rays, watching them open their really large mouths, and they act like a sieve for anything that's supposed to swim through it, so they can filter out their food. But instead of getting phytoplankton, what they're actually getting is microplastics. And so I felt compelled to create this piece, which is entirely out of plastic debris. The original is made out of, like, toothbrushes and all the plastic sand I collected while I was in Holbox and Isla Mujeres. So creating these kind of composite images makes you think about, what you eat is who you are. And it doesn't limit to whale sharks or manta rays. If you look at the oceans right now, and given current projections, there's going to be more plastic in the oceans than fish by 2050. But already, any fish sample that was extracted from the oceans, like sampling across different depths of the ocean, Charles Moore's alligator research vessel has been collecting fish samples for over the last 6 years, 10 years, and they've found plastic in literally every fish's belly. So it doesn't matter, what depth they swim at, they're still assimilating micro and nanoplastics in their diet, and therefore it's showing up in our food chain in terms of sushi, or if you go out to have fish, there's no fish that's been caught that doesn't have plastic in it. So we're bioaccumulating all of this as well. And then I most recently created this large-scale installation in Canada. I tried to recreate the horseshoe, the Niagara Falls, out of plastic bottles to show the impact of plastic being consumed every 5 seconds, and just in terms of the convenience of bottled water in Toronto. And every 5 seconds, we're tossing out 900 bottles. So just do the math for a minute. Like, the numbers add up so extensively. And yet, the interesting thing I discerned was that less than 12% of Canadian households are actually drinking bottled water. And so it's the minority that has this debilitating majority impact. So even, it doesn't matter how many of us are ignorant, ultimately all of our futures are tied together, all of our fates are tied together. So tomorrow is defined by the collective behavior, not just by a few. And it's amazing how a few ignorant people can destroy so much. And so it's a matter of getting everybody together, and that consensus, that moment of coalescing so many different perspectives into one ideology, one thought process, one cohesive state of action is the hardest thing to do, because as humans, we cannot agree on anything. And it's pretty hard to get people to come together on anything. Even if we know better, even if the science tells us the obvious facts, we still don't seem to move in the right direction. Case in point being the number of climate change related articles that come out on any given day, and just sheer evidence of, like, from the brush fires in Australia to the flooding in the Amazon, to looking at just the hurricanes and tropical cyclones we've been receiving, that's all category 4, category 5. Like, none of these events are, like, hard for us to see the damages from, yet we just ignore and go about business as usual, still pumping money into the fossil fuel industry, still creating subsidies for fossil fuel industry. So it's just unfortunate that even if we know better, that we can still behave in a way that's not actually addressing what we know or acting upon what we know. These are campaigns that I created for the ivory and rhino horn trades. So I work a lot on creating these mass media campaigns. I exclusively create art to raise awareness through advertising channels. So these were images that were put up on billboards, on buses, on trains, at airports, and that's really where you want to, like, reach people. You want to get the largest foot traffic, where you see people go in and out of the space often, and therefore there are more eyes looking upon this issue than anywhere else. And so I channel pretty much the same venues that Coca-Cola or any other big brand would, because those are the conduits through which you're most likely to get your message out to the right demographics. These were images. It's the same issue spoken in a different way. And that's the other thing I talk about, even with my current clients. I'm working on a project in the Amazon at the end of this month, for which I'll be filming, the intersection between community, conservation, and commerce, because the problem time and again where conflict arises is where money intersects with the life or death of a living being. So for instance, are they worth more alive or not? And that economic model is what we are constantly hedging our bets against, because if a rhino's horn is worth more than a rhino alive, which it's not, it's been calculated by economists that an elephant that's left alive is worth 76 times more than an elephant that is killed for its ivory or shot by a trophy hunter. So because there are so many tourists who could come and take a photograph of that one elephant, so over the course of its lifetime, and it lives up to 100+ years, like it can generate more revenue for the parks alive than it can if it were killed for any other reason. Same thing for rhinos. And so the value chain by which you keep something alive or dead, which itself is very human oriented, and that itself needs to change, but we're not there yet. So right now we're looking more from a perspective of, how do we show that this animal is worth more alive? And here's more campaigns on the same premise, looking at ways in which you can reach the right market. So if I'm talking to Chinese consumers, then I want to reach them in a language that is intuitive to them. So it's about looking at ways in which you can convey a topic in a manner that feels like it's coming from their own language, from their own people. So it doesn't feel like dissonance. It doesn't feel like counter information to what they feel like they would automatically gravitate to. And also people are more resistant to an outsider coming in and telling them how to do things. So the more we are cognizant of all of those biases, the better we can be at marketing, solutions and impact-driven actions toward the right consumer demographics. So these two images went viral in China because they were kind of illustrated in this anime graphic style. But also, I'll tell you this, when you're looking at art, when you're creating art for art's sake, you can use any color you want because you love colors and you have a certain affinity for a certain palette and you would go with that. But when it comes to campaigning, when it comes to art for action, art for application, you have to think through every aspect of what any color can mean in each culture and why you should choose one color over another. And there's a lot of thought that goes behind even, looking at fonts, typography, looking at layouts. So, negative and positive space. But even with color in this particular image, the maroon red that I chose was intentional because we initially wanted to do a more comic, like Scorsesean red. Like you see it in all these movies in Hollywood. And so you think that red would convey bloodshed and death because it's so bright and in your face. But in China, and for most part in Asian markets, that red symbolizes prosperity. And so if I put that red in the background, I would have essentially conveyed to them yeah, you should go ahead and kill more elephants. So I had to mute the red down to ensure that we convey the right content to the public, to tell them this is a sobering topic. This is not about prosperity. This is about bloodshed. This is about death. So it's a really interesting thing to have conversations with people on the ground in the culture you're trying to communicate it to, because they will inform you as to what colors mean for them and whether you can or cannot use that Pantone shade. Here's another image with basically those two Chinese characters that make up the elephant mean China in Chinese. And I went through a period where I really wanted to hold China accountable and make them look at the impact they were having globally. And if you can do the same motif, by which I mean the same symbols, the same imagery for different things, then there's continuity. So you're saying the same message over and over again, but you're saying it for all the different animals. So I did one for tigers using the same two icons. Then I did it for rhinos. And then I even did one for pangolins and for helmeted hornbills, because they're all being killed for the same market by the same consumers that can afford the people who can afford one of these things can afford all of these things. And so it's going pretty much to the same demographic. I'm also looking at how ultimately everything comes back to accountability. I'm looking at how when you're witnessed doing something, you're less likely to do it. If you're seen behaving badly, you're less likely to behave badly, because you're more conscious of the fact that someone is observing you, and that their judgment is coming to weigh upon you automatically alters your behavior. The very act of observation alters behavior. And so I created a whole series of animal images for the National Geographic Big Cats initiative, where the cats look directly at you, right? And so these were all animated, and you can go on my website to look at the animations, but they would all be blinking and staring at you to like look back at you. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't connect to other species because intuitively and intrinsically, we only relate to animals that have the same pupil proportions as we do. So these like if you look at big cats, they have more triangular eyes, and they don't have the same pupil proportions as we do. So instinctively, we don't feel that connection of like, they're my family, they're my kith and kin. Like I really care about protecting them. Like it doesn't come just inherently to us. We can think of it intellectually and go for it, but it's not the same as when you look at a gorilla or a chimpanzee. Like that level of bond that develops just because they're so similar to us. That's a very different mechanism that's at play there. It's called the Corporal Hypothesis. And so with these big cats, I created the cats out of human eye proportions. And that's why they look so haunting. Like people keep staring at them and don't know why. And it's because they're made out of human eyes, not big cat eyes. And so once again, it's playing on our subversive understanding of self and others. It's playing on subliminal messaging, and it's kind of subconsciously getting you to care about something that you've ordinarily overlooked. So how do you look at something you've overlooked? I always look at every image I give rise to. I'm always underscoring this premise of the plot. Like, are you looking at the plot? Which I mean, have you defined your problem set? By which I mean, like, have you asked the intelligent question? Have you raised the question in its most succinct, eloquent, and articulate frame? Because if you have done that, then the answer lies in the question itself. And that's what design thinking is about. And that's also where designers are different from artists. Artists tend to be more conceptual and abstract and can just play with things for the sake of playing and enjoy the act of, just form for its own sake. But designers have to resolve the idea of form with function, which means it has to have application at the end of the day. And that's where I look at, when you ask the right question, then you're framing your limitations, you're framing what you're looking at, and then you're looking through that particular box, that particular set, and then whatever solution you come up with is already framed within it. And when I say mind your language, I mean, are you looking at the way in which you're articulating your content? Because if you're going into an alternate market, they may or may not have the same words for something that you do in that language. For instance, when I was working in East Africa, looking at the bushmeat crisis, I couldn't go in and talk to them about bushmeat because in Swahili, they don't have a word for bushmeat. It's just meat, so it doesn't matter whether it's been wild caught or if it's grown in a farm in your backyard. For them, it's all meat is meat. Anything that's moving can be eaten, and that's how they perceive it. So while in Western thinking, in the English language, we have the distinction between bushmeat and livestock, they don't have that. So when you go in to talk to them about that issue, you have to be mindful of that and know the language in which you're articulating, because otherwise they just think it's a joke, or they think you're being silly. And then you basically don't move them in the right direction. You don't explain to them why they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And then I say state what's obvious, because oftentimes we overlook the thing that most needs to get said, and we assume that everybody knows what we know, and that's just not the case. Like when I did the campaign in Times Square against the ivory trade, I did this massive billboard about McDonald's right in the heart of Times Square. And the campaign read, ivory lost forever, so does extinction. Every tusk costs a life and destroys a family. Is it worth it? And we had like very graphic, clear images to show ivory comes from an elephant, that it's being killed, and the poachers are taking the ivory. It showed all of those images. Yet people came up to me and the number one question I got is, what is ivory? Like, people don't know what you think they should know. And so I always say that in every campaign you create, start with the most basic assumptions you're making and question if that assumption is real and true. And oftentimes it's not. It's like, if you assume that everyone knows something, they just don't. So like, say it, just say it and get it out of the way so that you can then assume, yes, now that I've said it, they're all on the same page as me. And then I say embed emotional triggers, because people aren't creatures of reason. We'd like to think we are, but we really are deeply emotional, irrational creatures. So when we do something, it's because we are angry, we're sad, we're really mad at something, and want to like see, you know, that injustice being corrected in the world, or we're really passionate about it, or we love it, or we're curious about it. And so it all comes from these like deeper, more emotionally instinctual understandings than it does from, you know, 1 + 1 = 2. It's not that linear, it's not that sequential, it's not that logical why we do or do not do something. So I think, you know, playing on emotion is why something reaches somebody. For instance, even Coca-Cola, for all, you know, that they put their product out there, they actually connect themselves to the emotion happiness. Coca-Cola brings happiness. That's what they claim. Is that true? No. But is that what they want you to believe? Yes, because, you know, the minute you tie it into a state of being and state of feeling, then you're more likely to consume it every time you're in that state of being or feeling, which is more frequent than a thought. And then if you look at, you know, the kind of images that got me into this game to begin with, into doing the career I do, which is a very like, I've made up my own career, and this is what I encourage all of you to do. Like, just push the boundaries and figure out how you can do what you love based on what you enjoy doing. So I loved art, I loved illustration, but I also really was a huge nerd, and I enjoyed science, and I liked being in on the conversations about change on the ground, working with organizations, going on expeditions. I definitely wanted to travel a lot. So I was figuring out a way that I could do all those things. And that's how I gave birth to my own career. And I came up with my own title as well, because my career didn't exist before me. And so I called myself a creative conservationist. So I highly encourage you each to like think about, you know, what are the things you love doing the most, and how can you bring all those things that you love doing together? So I always tell people, I'm like, be interdisciplinary, think about it outside of the box of what exists right now, because that might be something we really need, especially in today's world where things are ever more linked, and like it's a global economy, everybody's connected to everyone. There's nothing that you can give rise to that can have a global impact. So just be conscious and mindful and apply yourselves to have a positive impact instead of a negative one, and something that's fulfilling for you on a personal level. This particular image shows, you know, humanity evolving, and it's like, are we evolving into the Grim Reaper at the cost of life on Earth? And that's kind of the question that I leave everyone with always, is to look at this premise of, you know, are we part of the lifeline, the pulse of the planet, or have we stepped away from it? And I think that if you can consider this in every step of every action that you take, and stop taking for granted where your honey comes from, where your butter comes from, where your toothpaste comes from, like all these things are resources that are coming, and somebody's paying the cost for them. So if the more inclusive and more aware you are, the better choices you make, the better you vote with your wallet and with your dollars, and ask your parents to do the same, the more likely it is to have a positive impact across the board and not make these other beings pay the cost for your choices. So it truly comes down to being inclusive at the end of the day. Joe, how much more time do I have, or should I take questions?
If you're ready, Asher, let's jump to some questions.
Yeah, I would love some questions.
All right, perfect. Well, Asher, thank you so much. I love your story because it perfectly illustrates that there's no right or wrong way to get into something that you love. And sometimes you try a few different things, but eventually if you put your passions together, you can find something that you love doing and really have an impact. And your art definitely does that, speaking for our planet, speaking for biodiversity, speaking for animals that don't have that voice. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's meet some of our classrooms. So we're going to go to Mrs. Logan's group first. They're hanging out with us in Freehold, New Jersey. Let me get their microphone turned on. How we doing, New Jersey?
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Who's got a question for Asher?
Yes. Lots of questions. Here's one.
What do you feel about people having pets? Do you have any pets? If so, what kind?
That's a really good question. And okay, so I definitely think I'm opposed personally to puppy mills, and I I have a dog. His name is Onyx. He's an Aussie Dor, an Australian Shepherd mixed with a black lab. And he's a rescue. I got him from North Carolina because they shut down a puppy mill and they brought all these puppies up to New York, to Brooklyn. And I essentially just wanted to go donate food and like, you know, play with them for a while. But as such, that's not a possible thing to do. Like, it's a very rational thought that I figured I could go in there and not adopt a puppy and just play with them and leave them. Didn't happen. I went there, met this little fellow. He looked like a tiny little black bear cub, fell in love, and had to take him home with me. So yeah, so he's with me. He's been with me for about 2 years now, and best thing I've ever done. I love him. I think the love that a pet can give you is nourishing and personal and meaningful in a way that very few other relationships can give you that. Like a pet is pretty extraordinary, and animals are just extraordinary. So like, if you can have any animal, if you can rescue, I mean, throughout my childhood, I used to rescue everything. We rescued turtles, snakes. We used to go to like illegal markets and like rescue parrots and release them back in the wild. Like my mom has always been a proponent of rescuing and bringing things back and rehabilitating animals and releasing them back in the wild if they're meant to be in that environment, if they're not invasives and they're actually endemic, like if they're indigenous to that area and they've been taken out of their context. We always rescued and put them back in their context. Except like some of our parrots learned some unfortunate words along the way and they would be shouting that in the forest. So that was funny. But, you know, I always encourage rescuing, and I think animals are amazing to relate to. So if you get a personal friend in an animal, I highly recommend that. But I do think the pet industry is kind of scary, and we fish a lot of the oceans out for cat food, and like all the forage species are being taken out of the oceans. And so that's, you know, depleting the ocean ecosystems for food for, you know, sea lions and other animals that need it. So it's a mixed bag of nuts. You have to be weighing in on how far the pet industry is damaging. I don't think everybody should be hammering down on pets, but I think if you can rescue animals that are in a flawed system, go for that. But I don't think they should be breeding any more pets actively for consumption, especially designer pets. I think that's ridiculous.
All right. Well, both my dogs are rescue dogs, and I think those are the best kind of dogs, dogs that need a home. Let's see. Mrs. Castro's high schoolers are hanging out with us in Homestead, Florida. Let me get their microphone turned on. How we doing, Florida?
All right, guys. Yes, one of them have a question.
Yep.
Okay, Sophia, come on. Go ahead.
What type of accent do you have?
Oh, so I don't know. I honestly, every time I've talked to anybody in like the United Nations, people have just told me that I sound like I'm from all over the place and no one can place me. But I think that's the product of having lived everywhere at some point. And I just sound like a mutt. I have no idea. So I think I've been told I occasionally sound South African. I sound Australian, but my brother lives in Australia. I sound at times, I mean, this is a personal perspective, I suppose, if I get like inebriated, then I sound English. So, I mean, I just sound all over the map. And I think I've been transitioning because I've been living in New York for the last 18 years. And so my accent sounds more like a hodgepodge between trying to be American New Yorker, but like does not land there and just goes south of the border instead to like other countries, Brazil, South Africa, South America. So it just goes to other continents and countries. So I have no idea why I sound the way I do. I think I also pick up things along the way when I travel and depending on who I speak to. And so there'll be some inflections that come in just from hanging out with certain people for a period of time. So yeah, I don't have a definitive accent.
All right, fair enough. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the career you have made for yourself is it has given you the ability to travel and bear witness to so many things. And, you know, that leaves a mark. You take some of that with you whenever you visit somewhere.
Yep.
All right, Rochester, Minnesota, Mrs. Olson's group. Let me get your microphone turned on. How we doing, Rochester?
Hey guys.
All right, who's up?
Did you hear the question?
No.
No, I didn't.
How do you feel about invasive species?
I think invasive species are a product of our ignorance, right? They occur because we either have adopted exotic pets and then dispose of them irresponsibly, or it's because of, shipping routes bringing in species through the channels as they pull into harbor. Or it's usually because of human impact. It's us taking things from one place to another. And the more globalized we've gotten, the more we tend to take these carry-ons from one place to another that are unintended. And then we don't know how to manage the kind of cumulative consequences that ripple out from that one act having occurred. Even looking at rodents ending up in islands and exterminating indigenous species of insects or birds by drinking, they drink the eggs. And so then that particular bird, that ground dwelling nesting bird, can no longer propagate. And so, or brood. And so like, I always look at sort of, it's about us, and it's about us being more conscious, being aware of, the fact that when we go, we do get these hitchhikers, and can we take greater steps to ensure that we don't? And thus far, it's not really been possible. So invasives are a tricky business, and sometimes they've worked in our favor, and we don't seem to care that, that it comes at the cost of the ecosystem, like coffee or tea, like anything that we rely on is an invasive to certain climatic areas, or even wine vineyards. So like things that benefit us, we don't seem to consider invasive, but a lot of the plant species we see even are invasives, and we like it because it flowers one way or it fruits another, and it's pretty to us, or it benefits us. So we really are just looking at it from a very limited perspective. And as long as it serves us, we don't really think it's a problem. And if it's something that is causing a greater ripple that affects us inevitably, then we seem to care more about it. So like lionfish has become a problem more so because it's impacting the diving industry, and we lose a lot of the nurseries to this predatory fish particularly if it doesn't belong in that ecosystem. And for the dive industry and for other industries, like we want to ensure that the integrity of that reef system is protected. From a scientific perspective, of course, all invasives are a negative impact on those ecosystems, and for the most part, they outcompete endemic species and proliferate and occupy their ecological niche. So it's a hard argument to really come to a consensus about, but I think like, yeah, is it good for the planet? No, but we're sort of like these weird pollinators, or like we just take things to other places and like want to like spread more of those things, and we don't mean to, but it happens in the natural world in its own way. We just do it globally. So it's an interesting thing, like what is an invasive and how far has invasives been a problem in the past? Like how have plants or other things like carried over to other ecosystems in the past, like they have through driftwood and other mechanisms even before humans existed? It's a very complex conversation. So I think in conclusion, I would say that if we can be mindful of the areas in which we are actively introducing exotics that need not be there, for instance, rescuing pet turtles, or like getting pet turtles into your household and then putting it in your backyard, or like releasing it into a pond in your neighborhood, is not a smart decision, because that pet turtle may not be from that area at all, and oftentimes it's not. So like those small things can be addressed. The bigger things, that I think it's past the point of being able to really address it as effectively as we possibly can, because apart from rodent infestations, which are detrimental to those island ecosystems, looking at plant proliferation and things like that, that's a harder situation to approach.
All right. And I always, shake my head sometimes at the solution of, we have one invasive species, let's introduce another one to try and take care of it. So sometimes we think that we know a little more about our ecosystems and nature than we actually do. All right, Chatham, Ontario, grade 8's hanging out with Madame Brecca. Let me get that microphone turned on. Now I know the microphone might not be cooperating, but let's see. How are we doing, Chatham? Can you guys hear me? All right, the microphone doesn't sound like it's cooperating. So Madame Brecca, if you want to type it in the chat bar, there's a little chat bubble right at the bottom of your screen. And if you type that question in there, I will read it out. But while we wait for that question, if I need to visit another classroom, just give me a wave and I'll come grab another question from your classroom. I remember Mrs. Logan said they had a few questions, so I'll turn their microphone back on.
Great, thank you.
Did you always love science and art?
Yeah, I think, when you're really young, the thing that you gravitate to it naturally without having had anyone tell you otherwise, ultimately that's the thing that brings you the greatest happiness. And as a kid, I really enjoyed playing with paints and I loved science. And I was either out in the natural world exploring, pretending to be David Attenborough, or like role playing, just recreating characters that I enjoyed from books that I read, or I was, creating art about it, or illustrating or writing about it. Like I just like creative expression and the documentation of the natural world. And that just came to me effortlessly without having to undergo formal education, without having parents tell you otherwise. And so without any input, that's what came to me just intrinsically. And I think the things that you love doing as a child are the things that you really enjoy doing as an adult for a career. So if you don't let the external world pull you in directions based on whether there's money to be made in it, whether there's security to be had in it, whether there's even a career that is available that can do the things that you say you want to do at present, it may not be. But that's where I think you should be innovative and just forge your own path ahead and find a way to do what you really care about and do it the way you want to, because there's nothing that stops you from doing that other than you. I mean, the world can say all it wants, but ultimately, if you really believe in that being your calling, your path, your passion, then you find a way through that. You find the way through the no's and the doubts.
Absolutely. And I think, people can say all they want, but at the end of the day, I think we talk ourselves out of a lot of things that we want to do. And so taking those chances, taking those risks is a really important part of life. And you're going to love your career much more if it's something that you're passionate about and something you love getting up to do every morning. It's not going to feel like work, that's for sure. So I did get a question from our group in Chatham, and they're interested in the story you shared with us when you were in Africa about all the garbage you saw. And so they're really interested in what really stood out to you about that problem. And then, as someone who was 17, how did you get the courage to act on that?
So I think part of the stepping up and wanting to act on it came from my mom, because she's always encouraged me to stand up for myself and speak out for those who remain unheard. And I think that's where I draw my courage from, because I remember there was one time she and I went on this road trip and we saw in this village in Thailand, we saw this dog that was tied up to a pole. And this guy who's at that rest stop came out of the restaurant and was beating the dog. And my mom just snapped, and she took it upon herself to go up to him, speak to him. He wouldn't listen to her because he was too drunk and belligerent. And so she just took the stick from him and she's like, if I beat you, how would you feel about it? And so she basically took it upon herself to go and engage a person who could have pretty much hit her with the same stick he was hitting the dog with. But she's never let fear or anything stop her from doing what's right, like by holding people accountable, asking the question that's uncomfortable, or helping the thing that needs help in that moment, that needs a voice, that needs somebody else to step in, intervene, and protect it. Whether it's a young child, whether it's an animal that's being abused, whether it's a waste problem, it's something, and therefore you need to speak up on behalf of the whole planet. Like there's always someone who can lend a voice, and I think why not you? And that why not you was put in my head pretty early on. So I was just like, why not me? And you can go through your life thinking somebody else is going to do that, or you can be the one to do it. And oftentimes you're going to be the one to do it, because if it even has occurred to you to ask the question, why isn't somebody doing something? That somebody has to be you. So don't even ask the question, just be the answer. Go live being the answer.
All right, that's awesome. I think this is the perfect question to end on. Asher, this question was just sent to me by our group in Florida, but I'm going to turn their mic on. I'm going to let them ask it themselves. I think it's a neat question, and I think it'll be a good way to wrap up today on. So Mrs. Castro's group, if you want to ask that question to Asher, whoever's question it was, come on up.
Nice to meet you. I have an
Hi.
interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a chance to become any type of animal, it could be either extinct or still to this day, which one would it be, and why would you choose that specific animal?
I love that question. So I Oh my gosh, that's a rough one. Okay, the animal that I personally identify with the most is the scorpion mouse, the grasshopper mouse. It lives in the Sonoran. And the reason why I love this little mouse is because it has the safety of its burrow to hide out with its mom and just be there, you know, nuzzling away and just like having the comfort of home. But it just feels called by the wild that's outside of its burrow. And it leaves its burrow by 3 weeks. And it lives in the most poisonous environment. There's so many centipedes and scorpions and snakes that can kill it. But its name, truly earned, it eats these venomous things. It not only fights them, but eats them and subsists off these venomous creatures that could be its greatest threat to survival. And it has such a like strong resilience to its existence. It's so tenacious and curious and wants to find out more about this greater world that might be unsafe, but it's willing to take that risk, that chance. And from 3 weeks of age. And the coolest thing about it is that it looks at a full moon and howls, which I just do that. I love howling at the moon because I think it's beautiful. Why not join the wild spirit and call out to the moon? But I just love that this tiny mouse has that much character, that much mettle and courage to take it upon itself to live wild and be wild and find its fullest and highest expression, even though, you know, everything could kill it. Like it just goes out there and howls at the moon and lives its best life. So I think there's no excuse for us who have given much more care by our parents to really step out there and howl at the moon. Like I think we should be just as tenacious as that mouse is.
All right, I think that's perfect. I think we could all use a little more scorpion mouse in each and every one of us. So Asher, huge thank you for today. Absolutely love your story, love the work you're doing, and love your outlook on life. And I think, you know, if the students take anything away from today, it should be to go after what they love, go after what they're passionate about, and try to make a difference doing it. So thank you so much, Asher. Great to have you joining us on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. All right.
My pleasure. Have a good one. I'm sorry you guys couldn't see me, but you can look me up. I'm pretty easy to find.
All right.
And I'm waving goodbye. I can see you.
I just turned the microphones on, boys and girls. If you want to say goodbye and thank you, then we'll sign off for today.
Bye.
All right. Awesome work, boys and girls. Hope to see you over the next 2.5 weeks in some more events. And Asher, safe travels in the Amazon. We'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.